Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sudhir Pandey, and I welcome you to Ahmedabad University. We are a research university, and we believe in a different kind of education. And we would love to invite people who talk about education and actually have some opinion on this. And today's panel is on the same, and you would have seen that. So we are very happy to welcome one of the very interesting voices and critical voices, Professor Ashish Kulkarni, to Ahmedabad University and to the conversation series. Professor Ashish Kulkarni is an assistant professor at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. He runs the blog Econ for Everybody and has a PhD in macroeconomics. His experience in this field has ranged from building and implementing a statistical model for major financial institutions in the US to analyzing the key trends of US financial investors, to doing econometric forecasting, competitor analysis, and country level briefing at Suzlon also. He had a very good stint at Suzlon. At one point of time, it was India's largest renewable company. Another important thing about Ashish is that he asked very interesting questions about Indian higher education. For instance, is there a market for higher education in India? Uh, are there economic forces of demand and supply at play in this sector? And what is being supplied, and more importantly, what is being demanded? And what problems does learning not being the end goal for this market cause? So these are some interesting questions that he asks, and he promises to answer these questions in today's conversation. With Ashish, the in-house faculty, Professor Puneet Arora, will be in conversation. He's an assistant professor of economics at Ahmedabad University, and he has research interest in the area of development, behavioral and experimental economics, and economics of education. He has conducted several field experiments within the Indian and American education system to study the causal impact of different behavioral nudges on student learning and attendance. Puneet holds a PhD in economics from Georgia State University and MA degree in economics from Delhi School of Economics. So I welcome both of you to the conversation series, and we are happy to have you. Before I hand it over to Puneet, there are certain uh, uh, admin rules. Everybody will be muted except our two speakers, your audio, video, both. And both the people will talk to each other for next 60 to 65 minutes. In the meanwhile, you can put your questions in the everyone chat box. We'll take that question curated, and then we'll come back at the end of the conversation somewhere around 5:05 to 5:10. So thank you so much. And I request Puneet to take it forward.
Thank you, Sudhir, and thank you, Ashish, for agreeing to come and engage in this conversation with us. So, I mean, as Sudhir described, your major area of interest is macroeconomics policy, but you're being penalized for writing the blog called Econ for Everybody, because we are going to talk about something which concerns everybody, especially in the audience here. Right. And that, as we all know, is higher education. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, before we begin, I'd like to sort of read an excerpt from the introductory piece that we had used to promote this event, which sort of essentially captures the idea of today's conversation. Sure. So higher education has lofty goals to foster the joy of learning, to develop a research mindset, and to set students up to be lifelong learners. The reality on the ground is often less novel. Much of higher education is focused on the inputs, such as learning, teaching, textbooks, attendance, rote learning, exams, and on the immediate output, such as grades, degrees, jobs. The exalted outcome, learning for life, is often lost. Higher education has become dispersed and complicated, with new edtech suppliers joining long-established brick and mortar universities. So in essence, I mean, this is going to capture the questions, the discussions that we're going to have today. Right. So without further ado, let me actually start with the fundamental question, which Sudhir also mentioned, that higher education as a market. So in your three pieces that you've written on Public Policy Forum, where you talked about higher education as a market, who are the consumers, who are the producers. I mean, for the audience here, for me, we'd love to know, why are you calling it a market? Because as economists, when we say market, there's a product that is being sold. There are consumers, there are producers. Consumers have preferences, producers have their own objectives. Right. So in higher education setting, what are these sort of aspects?
Okay, so no gentle warm-ups in today's talk, which is awesome. If you have to think about applying the framework of a market to education, you have to figure out what is being demanded and, as you mentioned, what is being sold. I would argue what is being sold comprises of at least three things and probably more. And those three things are, and that is why I think of college as a bundle. You are selling the fact that you've learned, which is a signaling of the certificate. You are selling the learning itself, and you're selling the ability for students to be bunched together in very close quarters for 3 years. Now, this could be residential, could be non-residential, but the memories, the friends, the peer networks that you form are, I would argue, one of the most important components of what a college degree gives you. And it gives you more than this, but to me, these three things are part and parcel of what a university or what a college education ought to comprise of. And if that is being supplied, my argument is students and recruiters. I would say that both of them are part of the demand side where education is concerned, but both students and recruiters are confused about exactly what it is that they should be asking for. And it is this confusion between what we think we sell and what students and recruiters think they are buying, or in general, what society is buying, that leads to a lot of disenchantment with the higher education market, because we are not clear about what we are selling and people are not clear about what they are buying.
Yeah, that's an interesting side. So, I mean, you described that consumers are buying that three pronged stuff that you described. So, learning and the certification for that learning,
Yeah.
and the peer group. So, but in essence, I mean, when we think of as an economist, a consumer has an optimization problem in mind. I mean, there's an objective function. And the way you describe the subjective function comprises of these three things, subject to certain constraints.
Yep.
Right. So what would be the constraints that a consumer has in mind here? And is the consumer actually optimally choosing the right set of education that he or she should be choosing?
That's a dangerous question for me to answer where society is concerned, but I can speak from a personal perspective. I don't think I was very clear about what I was buying when I was doing my undergraduate. And I think I was a little more clear about what I was buying when I was doing my master's. And I think I was very clear about what I was buying when I was doing my PhD. So my PhD was entirely about signaling. I needed the degree in order to be able to work full-time as a professor. So my PhD took nearly 7 years to complete, out of which 5 years were pure laziness and 2 years was work. What I learned in those 2 years was the learning. But the reason I stuck it out for the remaining 7 years was because I needed that signaling. But I think it took me those many years of higher education before I myself became clear about what it is that I wanted. And the cynicism had set in a sense, at the master's level itself. And I wish that cynicism hadn't set in, because I think I would have learned so much more. But the way I would answer your question about what it is that students should be demanding or do demand or ought to demand, I often use Bryan Caplan's question. And if you'll allow me to reformulate this question for the audience, Bryan Caplan has a very interesting question. I'm going to modify it from his book, The Case Against Education. He says, I'm going to give you two choices. I can give you the chance to study in the best university in the world. You can have an all-star faculty. You can have the best learning facilities, the best infrastructure. Everything that is on your wish list for the ideal university is there, but you will never be able to prove to people that you attended this university. So you can go and spend 2 years in Harvard, but you will get no certificate. Are you okay with that? Or the other option is you get a certificate from whichever university you want in the world, but you can't actually go there to learn. So which of these two choices will you take? And my first year undergrad students almost always say learning. And my fourth semester master student almost always say certification. So I would like to carry this experiment out, on a more systematic basis and see how the answer varies with age and the number of years you spend in the education system. But to me, on a very informal basis, and this is across at least 7 to 8 years of having asked this question, there is an inverse relationship between the likelihood of choosing signaling the longer you spent as a student in the education system. So I think students, through the act of attending university, become clear in their own heads about what they are paying for, at the end of the day signaling. But when they come in, they tend to be rather more idealistic and say they're coming in for the learning. We do something to them as sellers of education that seems to transform their objectives. And they become clearer. I'm not necessarily saying that's a better answer, but they're clearer in their own heads about what it is that they want by the time they're done with college.
Okay. So, I mean, as an experimentalist, so when you make this kind of a claim, what comes to my mind is probably this is a thought experiment, right? Yeah. So in my mind, I may be responding in a particular manner, while in my mind I may be thinking something different.
Mhm.
Right? I'm responding differently because you're asking me, and I'm under the scanner, right?
Yep.
So I don't want to be caught in a wrong position to you.
Right.
So now, if I were to think of an alternative scenario wherein people are actually in that situation, wherein they have a choice of choosing just the learning versus learning plus the degree or the certification. And when we think of such a scenario, I mean, what comes to our mind is the MOOCs that are out there these days, like the Coursera, EDX. I mean, they provide us this opportunity wherein I can go, I can audit a class. In fact, even the universities provide us that opportunities these days. But we'll not get credit for that. We'll not get a certification for that.
Right.
And forget about others. I mean, I personally, when I had that opportunity, I was looking for doing courses. I would also sort of enroll with certification, because in the end, it's a signal, as you said. I mean, if I'm learning something, whether I'm learning it partly, fully, I mean, that's a different question. But if I'm sort of spending my time and effort at learning something, I would want to signal it to the world, especially the employer, because I mean, one of the questions in the polls was, what matters, like, as an end product of the higher education? Why do you want to get that higher education? And the majority response was, I mean, we want jobs afterwards, right?
Right.
So if employers are so keen at looking at your CVs in filtering you out or in for an interview and the subsequent processes, as a student, what is the fault? Like, as students, are we doing something wrong by voting with our feet and going for learning plus the certification, or just the certification rather than learning solely?
Yeah, so I think one of the questions that I saw pop up asked the same thing, and I completely agree. Both are possible. And at the end of the day, I think we're trying to answer the question of which it is that is emphasized more and which it is that should be emphasized more, signaling or learning. But sure, you get both in a university, absolutely. So I'll answer your question in two ways. One, in terms of how difficult it is to frame a question where in a laboratory setting or just being part of a survey means that you give the answer that people expect to hear. But if you think about it, as a student, I know I have asked this question. I shouldn't be a hypocrite about this. Perhaps you have and have not. I would like to very much ask the audience if they have. But if as a student, you've asked the question, what are the important questions while preparing for the examination? Then you, through your action now, not as a part of a response, through your actions, you're choosing to optimize for marks rather than learning. When you ask what the important questions are, you're implicitly saying, I don't want to study the whole syllabus, which means by definition, you're not maximizing learning, you're maximizing marks. And there is now a difference between the two. So I would argue both in terms of your actions and also in terms of your response as a student, you do signal and state that you are optimizing for marks rather than learning. And this now brings me to your second question. Are students at fault? No, I would argue they're not at fault at all. They are responding to the incentives that the system has set up for them. As you say, whether it is recruiters or even in school, it is your parents who always ask, how much did you score? And the second inevitable question that every single Indian student knows, how much did the topper get? What do you want to find out? The difference, how much is, relatively speaking, your performance? Is it good or is it bad? So whether it is responding to the incentives while you're in school or whether it is while responding to the incentives while you're in college, we are simply responding to the environment that we find ourselves a part of, where mark maximization is what will lead to both status in society as well as the ability to find a job. So no, I don't blame the students at all. Should we be blaming the recruiters? Should we be blaming the universities? Is blame the correct word to use? Are all questions that are very much up for discussion. But no, students, I think, are simply responding to what we have set up as a system, and they say, all right, this is a game we have to play. We're going to play it.
Yeah, agreed. So moving from the consumer end to the producer end, and producers over here, sticking to the traditional system of education, and we'll definitely bring in the MOOCs in our conversation at some point in time.
Yep.
But till date, students are heavily studying at traditional university setting rather than doing degrees in an online medium or doing most of the courses in an unbundled manner at MOOCs. So therefore, universities are also responsible for the product that's being sold today, right? Or being demanded by consumers. So what is it that they have in mind? What is it that goes in their optimization problem? I mean, again, as an econ student, when I think of a producer, I mean, all of a sudden, what comes to my mind is the profit maximization problem.
Yep.
Right. So over here, are the universities also running with the same mindset wherein the end goal is to maximize profit, and then sort of you decide on the variables according to what maximizes my profit? And if that is the objective, then can we change that objective so that we reach a stage which both you and I and the audience here knows? I mean, we know what's wrong with the education system, we know what would be right thing to do with the education system, but none of us are sort of moving in that direction. We are, in fact, I mean, if anything, we might be moving away from that. Right. So what do you think is the producer actually doing here, and what should they be doing? Like a positive versus a normative question, if I were to ask.
Wow, that's a difficult question to untangle for a variety of reasons. But let me begin by saying that, yes, I think education is and ought to be thought of a business. So it's the fact that you and I are both from the field of economics means this comes very naturally to us. That, hey, boss, if somebody's putting in some effort, so if somebody is making sure that a service is being provided, they ought to be remunerated for it. So yes, much as we like to sugarcoat the fact and talk about education as an ennobling influence and the fact that it isn't really a business, but let's face facts, it is a business at the end of the day. Somebody somewhere is preparing a balance sheet of both your university and my university, as they should. It's a business. And which means you want to be able to maximize your output and minimize your costs. And that will entail a whole host of things. That will entail, say, for example, trying to figure out what is the largest manageable classroom that we can have in terms of size of students. How can we minimize expenditures? How can we make sure that we get the biggest bang for our buck? And as with any business, so also with education, you are going to get certain things that, and here is where I think it's important to distinguish between people who own the business and the people who work in the business. So what a professor wants or what a teacher wants in terms of the ideal outcome is very different from what the professor wants as an employee of an organization. So that fundamental tension is always going to exist. So what I want as an employee of the Gokhale Institute vis-a-vis what I want in terms of my ideal university naturally has to be different, because at the end of the day, Gokhale Institute is going to pay my salary. So I need to do well by Gokhale Institute, because without the sustainability of business, I'm not going to be paid a salary. So yes, profit maximization is very much a part of education. But to bring in another term from economics, what you then want to worry about is incentive compatibility. How do we set up the system so that universities are incentivized to give the best kind of education for the students while being able to maintain a healthy level of profits? And there, I know you said we would trace this later in the conversation, but utilizing technology better in order to provide cheaper education to a higher number of students and extremely expensive education to a smaller group of students, I think is where universities will go in the near future. So you will want to use EdTech, you will want to either incorporate or build up alternatives to MOOCs that allow you to provide education at scale to many people at a fraction of the cost that we do right now. But to those students who want to invest both the time and money, and there are inequity concerns over here, but I won't get into them right now. But to those students who are willing to invest the time and money, yes, you should provide the kind of education that you and I am presuming on your behalf, but at least I would like to be able to provide in a university. But if a student is unable to provide either that time or that money, then yes, MOOCs or EdTech very much ought to be a part of the conversation. And that is where I think profit maximization in such a way that the experiences of the student are not harmed will materialize. You want to optimize for what a certain group of student wants and want to be able to optimize for what another group of students wants. And we need to acknowledge the fact that there are two different groups of students. We see them every time in classrooms. Typically speaking, 10 to 15% of the class ask the questions. The remaining 80 to 85%, usually speaking, doesn't, unless we make it our business in life to force them to ask questions. But that implicit split is there. Acknowledge that split and figure out how to address both of these groups separately, I think is something that we should be working towards.
Okay. So, I mean, as we realize, we can't stay away from a discussion on MOOCs. It has to, I mean, online education has to figure in. I mean, especially, I mean, they've always been there, but the last 1 year, one and a half year has given that exogenous shock to the education world, wherein probably there's been a strong push towards online education over the in class or on campus education. So taking a leap from that, so what do you think, I mean, in your own words, in your own sort of judgment, what is this MOOC, and what kind of education model do they have? How similar or how dissimilar is that from the traditional university education system?
Okay, so I'm going to reference my experiences for having taught online for the last 18 months. And like you said, the pandemic has fundamentally forced us to ask ourselves what exactly it is that we deliver in a classroom, whether online or offline. And it has raised a whole host of interesting problems. To half of these problems, I don't have an answer myself, but I'll just list out the problems and we'll see where the discussion takes us. The analogy that I found the most useful was the analogy for when we as a society switched from steam engines to using electric engines. And factories had to be reconfigured to adjust for the fact that we have a new means of power within the factory. And I think the pandemic has forced us to ask ourselves if the university needs to be reimagined, because what earlier used to be a classroom now has suddenly become a device in everybody's pockets. It has become, in theory, possible to listen to your professor while sitting in your pajamas in your bedroom. And in fact, not even listen, just log in. All of us know that students tend to log in, but are not really there. And they can then listen to the recording the night before the exam at 2x the speed. So in much the same way that you had individual electric dynamos replacing one major steam-powered engine in a factory, you now have a large number of devices replacing people like you and I talking to people in a classroom. And students have gotten habituated to this. So one problem is the fact that students are going to, whether explicitly or implicitly, say, why can't we retain some of the features of the online classroom? So why do we need to have all classes offline? Which is, I would argue, a valid question, not just because of the convenience factor, but say, for example, Puneet, we think that you're the best person to teach a particular course at the Gokhale Institute. Just because you happen to be located in Ahmedabad, there's no reason for us to not be able to make sure that you teach a course to our students in Pune. So each university can say that, all right, X% of courses are online, X% are offline. Even if it is an offline course, X% of the classes can be delivered online or whatever it may be. But that is one thing that I think universities are going to have to figure out going forward. Should we return exclusively to a brick and mortar model? And if not, then how do these changes get implemented and to what extent? And I think all universities are going to have to figure this out individually, one part. And the second part that confuses me about MOOCs and students is, I think I used to think of YouTube videos as a complement to my teaching, but the pandemic quite explicitly made not just YouTube videos, but every video online very much a substitute. Students can and should ask, why should they learn from me? So principles of economics will say, for example, MRU or edX or MIT OCW, or there are 1,000 other videos online. Am I better than them? No, I'm not. So should they not be learning from there? Is it not then my job to simply point out that, hey, you know what, watch this video, come back and we'll speak about it, rather than I try to explain don't reinvent the wheel, especially when it is available at exactly the same point through the same device at basically a price of zero. So to what extent is online learning a substitute? To what extent is it a complement? How should classes be reorganized? How should the mode of education be rethought of once the pandemic ends? Are questions that you want to ask yourself within the framework of a university education. And the larger question that we need to ask ourselves is, in the near future, will students still continue to prefer a university degree? Or will they break the mold altogether and are MOOCs where we are going to go? I don't think that is going to happen. But I do think that universities will need to look more like MOOCs in the years to come. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure of, but it's going to happen.
Yeah. So, in that same thought, so when we talk about MOOCs, we are still far away from universities adopting that structure themselves and allowing students. Even Ahmedabad University has started sort of accepting a few of those certifications and all.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, universities are still far away from that.
Yeah.
So now when you study using those courses online delivered on any of the MOOC platforms, what are some of the differences when you were to learn the same thing on a campus? Mm-hmm. So basically, I'm trying to guide our conversation towards the idea that when I'm doing it online, I'm not interacting with anybody except maybe like a professor, and that too, it's a one-way conversation.
Yeah.
Right? In a classroom, the advantage is that you have several students, so you have that peer network, you have faculty to interact with like face to face. So how do you see these two? And most importantly, I mean, when I studied at Ahmedabad University, I tell the world that I studied at Ahmedabad University with sort of my collars up.
Yeah.
But when I do a course from Harvard University on a course era, like a professor from Harvard University, I still don't feel that proud and tell the
Yeah.
world that I did a course from Harvard University. So how are these two things? I mean, how do you balance them? How do you take them forward?
How do you take them forward will have two connotations. One, how do I think the market will take this forward? And how do I think at a personal level, should this be taken forward? Which takes us back to the signaling versus learning aspect. When you buy from Coursera and when you buy from Ahmedabad University or any university, you should be clear about what you're buying. And if you're buying the prestige, but then you also implicitly feel that the learning isn't as good as the prestige, then should the university say to you, hey, you know what, you're still going to get an Ahmedabad University degree or a Gokhale Institute degree, but I unbundle the learning. If you want to take X% of your courses online, I'm fine with it. These are the pre-approved list of MOOCs from where you can go and access the course. And great, we'll give you a certificate. Will that happen? For a variety of reasons. Inertia, reluctance, changing business models. Like you said, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So for those reasons, I don't think MOOCs will be able to beat universities just quite yet. But I think there will be quite literally a battle fought between students and universities, where students demand from universities that they become more friendly where MOOCs are concerned. So I don't think it's a question of MOOCs killing universities. I think it's a case of society forcing universities to transform however little or however much into something that looks a little bit more like a MOOC and a little bit less like a university, is where I think it is going to happen. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I would argue on the whole, it's a good thing. As a student, I wish I had the opportunity when I was a student to learn from the best in the business. Now technology allows you to do that. But there still is, having said all of this, I think there very much is a role for both universities and professors, which courses to take and to mentor students as they do this online learning. So our job perhaps in the future might entail many more office hours and much lesser of classroom teaching. Or we might be given as employees of a university, X students, these are under your tutelage and care. They want to focus, in my case, on economics, but they have other subjects that they want to listen to. And it's my job to guide them through what they should be doing next. And something else that I would like to speak about, if time permits, maybe later on in the conversation, is then the job of the professor becomes to say, hey, you know what, this is what you've learned. I'm going to help you apply. So set up research projects, set up project-based learning, make sure that students actually apply whatever it is that they've learned, is where perhaps our job will change in the near future. But classroom teaching, I think, I wish it doesn't happen. I love teaching, but I think classroom teaching is going to have to go down.
Yeah. When I imagine universities moving towards more of these online courses, there's a fear that I have in my mind, which actually emerges from what we see in the food industry. So over time, what has started to happen with the food industry is we've started seeing more of McDonald's wherever we go. We've started seeing more of Domino's wherever we go, right?
Yeah.
I'm just afraid, like, what if we start seeing courses that our students are doing, but that don't have any Indianized element in them, right? So right now, the way we teach, I mean, we try to bring a lot of public policy elements or whatever subject we're teaching. A lot of Indian examples are given to students because they should understand the fabric of the nation and what problems, what solutions are happening around us.
Yeah.
The moment you ask them to do a course in Harvard University, maybe, I mean, there'll be one or two examples that may come from developing world, but more or less, I mean, when you or I were students, I mean, a lot of courses had probably the entire literature about the Western world, right? And that doesn't give us much of information about what's happening in India. Right. So will that spirit of knowing your own country be lost, and then you start sort of, you become a world agent, but you forget your own country behind?
So two responses. One, I think that is where there still is very much a role for the professor in terms of mentoring, in terms of localizing the examples, in terms of making sure that, hey, you know what, all right, you watch this and this is relevant for that particular sociological setting. But in the Indian context, you also need to learn about XYZ. So that is exactly where the role of a professor as a mentor through those conversations or through those rather more restricted classroom sessions comes into play. And the second thing is, let me use this opportunity to express my wish that EdTech in India at least did a better job than it is doing right now in terms of creating more localized content. Perhaps I'm being a little unfair when I say this because I haven't done too many courses offered by Indian EdTech startups. But I do get the impression that Indian EdTech startups are more about cracking examinations than they are about actual learning. So maybe that's something that needs to change at the margin as well. Both how we add on to whatever it is that the MOOCs give you, but also MOOCs themselves become better and more contextualized for whichever economy they are a part of. In our case, India, and that's relatively easy to do because we have a very large addressable market. But yes, what to borrow an analogy from Peter Thiel, what he speaks about in terms of globalization, the globalization of education without a local context would be a very sad thing to see. And I agree, that's one of the risks of the direction in which we're heading, 100%.
Yeah. So, there comes the point that therefore university education is important, like on-campus education is important. The role of professors is always there. In that, I would want you to sort of throw a little more light for the audience here on one of your ideas, which is like universities help you sort, right? Maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing. You don't know. Probably you can throw more light on that. But what is this sorting idea that you sort of floated around?
So one of the functions of universities, quite literally, is to say that, all right, because you got into this university, you by definition are better than everybody who did not. Like you said, that may or may not be true. But that's one of the functions. The sorting function applies at the time you get into a university. So I don't know how Ahmedabad University selects its students. At the Gokhale Institute, we have an entrance exam both for the undergrad and the postgrad section. And so therefore, like I said, at least by definition, the fact that you made it, but the others did not, means that you're better than them. And that very much is what we use when we go and speak to companies that come to Gokhale Institute for recruitment. That look, so many students write an entrance examination, but only so many get through. And that by definition, we are one of the top, whatever it is, colleges in the country for economics and so on and so forth. So that's one example of sorting. But the second level of sorting takes place within the university. And that's where marks, unfortunately, come into the discussion. So I'm sure you've experienced as a professor. I know I have. The battle for half a mark. Sir, ये mark बढ़ा के दे दो. I'm using Hindi. I'll translate that into English in just a second. But यहाँ पे इतने कम marks क्यों मिले? So that negotiation is something that every professor these days has to go through. Grade inflation is one problem, but the fact that you have to be better than your peers and be seen as being better than your peers is something that a student has a lot of pressure for. And that's the second part of sorting. And this takes me back to an earlier question that you had both raised and implied. Part of the problem is the fact that recruitment happens on the basis of grades. So certain firms, in fact, at the master's level, say that they want more than X% in your 10th, in your 12th, in your undergrad, and in your postgrad. And the kind of pressure that students have to go through in order to sit for placements is, there's no other word for it. It's sad. The kind of competition that exists for marks is horrible, but that's the other part of the sorting argument. So sorting happens twice: once when you get into a university, and once when you leave the university. Some companies are bucking the trend and saying that we're not going to take a look at grades altogether, but those companies are few and far in between. For the most part, sorting is what we're stuck with. And you only need to take a look at Delhi University right now. All of us have been reading about it. The 100% thing is madness. I got 81% in my 10th grade. And I remember I was very happy, well, not ecstatic, but I was very happy with the marks that I got. But these days, 100% is the bare minimum. And that's, actually, I don't know where we're going in terms of sorting.
Right. So, I mean, in that sense, I mean, to me, it seems like this is a problem that we have started to have like in recent times.
Yeah.
But is that the case, or is it that it probably existed always in probably every society, just that now there are means for us to figure that out? Like I was describing earlier, that with MOOCs, you started seeing that option wherein you can just audit the course without paying any money, versus you do the course and get a certification, but you have to pay sort of a big amount for that, right?
Yeah.
So were we always confused that when we go to a university, we go for learning, when actually we might be going for like that sorting bit, wherein I do rote learning so that I can, I mean, firstly, the point is to get the first level of sorting. I do rote learning to get into a university, and then I do rote learning to get out of it with flying colors.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe the problem was always there, right? It's just that we may have realized the problem now because of the options that are available around us now. And if that is the case, are we too late on the boat to correct the problem, or what is your thought? Like, are there still ways? Can we still catch the boat and correct the problem?
I don't know if we can. Well, I'll answer the first part of your question first. Has some sort of sorting mechanism always applied? Yes, absolutely. It's just become more accentuated now. And I would argue grade inflation has made the problem worse. So when, like I said, when I graduated from the 10th standard, I scored 81%, 81, 82, I don't remember exactly. And I was very happy with those marks. And similarly, in my undergrad and my postgrad, whatever marks I got, I was never the topper, but acceptable levels of performance. But these days, anything below, even marginally below full marks is seen as not being acceptable. So the problem, I would argue, has become more accentuated. In a sense, the problem has become more accentuated both because the number of students graduating keeps going up year on year and the number of jobs available hasn't kept pace to a commensurate degree. So it's grade inflation. It's a fact that we have many more students graduating, but not enough students being employable, not enough jobs being created. All of that has made the problem much more noticeable today. Absolutely. How should we and how can we solve this, and are we too late for it? I honestly don't know. I don't think I ought to claim that I know what the answer is. But if I could be allowed to get into my utopian mode, I would want a world where we don't place as much emphasis on marks and place much more emphasis on work. And what I mean by work is do the project and be evaluated on the quality of the work that you do rather than the quality of the answers that you write in an examination. But the reason I say that this is utopian is because I know it's easy for me to say, but things like this just don't scale and they become very contingent on the kind of professor who's teaching. And that means by definition that it can't be something that can be easily replicated across the country. So which is why I say I don't know what the answer is, but I do find myself wishing that we didn't fetishize marks quite as much as we do these days.
And so in the current times, I mean, the pandemic that has occurred, and now, I mean, more or less, we've started saying that we are beyond the pandemic, and the life has started to sort of come back, at least on campuses.
Yep.
But last 1.5 years, we've all been on the online teaching mode, right? So, which is again a shock, which is a natural experiment of its own kind.
Yeah.
So, and typically these shocks do lead to changes which last for a long time or forever.
Yep.
So what are some of those changes that you expect? Now, this is different from MOOCs. I mean, MOOCs were always there, but this pandemic, has it led to some fundamental changes that MOOCs became famous all of a sudden, or even the classroom teaching that moved to online mode? I mean, that was a different way of delivering lectures. What are some of these changes or something else that I may be missing that are going to stay forever now? The education model that's going to change forever. So what are some of those components that you believe will last?
Okay. One, I don't think it'll be quite as, there still will be professors who will say that devices are not allowed in the classroom. And in some cases, there's very good reasons for doing so. But I think we will see a small cultural shift in terms of devices in classrooms becoming much more acceptable. There will be exceptions on both sides. So there might be professors who allowed that from before, and there might be professors who in the future will still not allow them. But as a whole, I would expect there to be some sort of a shift in the average usage of devices within classrooms, number one. Second, and I very much hope that this is true, hopefully we will change our examination systems for the better. The notion that we have taught students for 18 months using online technologies, but then we will say that the best way to evaluate you is to not allow you to use online technologies. I think there's a very deep paradox over here, and it ought to be resolved. Boss, if you're going to spend the rest of your life depending upon the internet and collaborative teamwork in order to achieve or get work done, then that is how we should be evaluating you. So at the very least, open book examination should become the norm. That will force us as professors to ask more imaginative questions, and that I think will force students to become better at, well, writing better answers, and in general, having the ability to research better, which ultimately is what they're going to do in one way or the other. The third thing that I think will change is hopefully we will start to offer many more courses by people who are not in the town that you're a part of. So both Ahmedabad and Pune, I think, suffer from, I don't know, I've been to Ahmedabad only twice in my life, so I really shouldn't be speaking about Ahmedabad, but I think we suffer in the sense that we don't have access to the kind of industry professionals that colleges in Bombay and Bangalore might. And if I want to invite somebody from either of these two cities or anywhere else in the world for that matter, I should be able to now post-pandemic. Not for all courses, not for all lectures in all courses, but remote teaching, I think, will become much more prevalent. And fourth, I hope that professors will use much more of online resources, even if they're teaching offline. So can we use games that have been designed online? Can we show videos that have been designed online? Can we call guest speakers to debate with while we are teaching a class? So the usage of the internet, not just in terms of resources, but in terms of connectivity with experts from outside, is, I think, something that we should all look forward to changing. The one thing that I think is going to change, and I'm not sure if it's a good thing or not, is I think students are going to want to say, well, boss, why do I need to attend all classes in a semester? The natural experiment that you spoke of, if the data shows us that educational outcomes, however you measure them, have been discernibly not different for the students who graduated in these past 18 months, then what should we as professors take away from the answer to that question? That, hey, boss, if you're able to achieve the same thing without making 75% attendance mandatory, then is 75% attendance really mandatory? And if not, then what happens next? Is a problem that I know we are going to face. How we are going to solve it, I don't have the faintest idea.
And with this last part that you described, it brings me, I mean, it makes me think of a research idea that I once had, which is, I mean, even at Ahmedabad University, we have that policy wherein students are supposed to attend a minimum number of classes. But with online teaching, what happened is students may be logged in, but probably, I mean, as you and I would know very well, and students better than us, how many of them are actually attending those lectures?
Right.
It's a different question. And the scores haven't probably gone down, they've gone higher.
Exactly.
During this online teaching. So when we think of these carrot and stick kind of policies related to attendance, which most of the universities or the school systems have had, like in at least the recent past, because attendance is said to be important. Like, how important is it in increasing learning? That's a debatable question. With you, that attendance probably may not be a good indicator of student learning, and online world would have made us realize that with students not attending. I mean, they're optimizing. If they're not coming to class, they're optimizing, and they may be spending their time better elsewhere. So this is something that, I mean, as instructors, we should learn.
Exactly. So I often used to explain Goodhart's law by speaking of attendance. So if attendance is to be used as a proxy for learning, which at the end of the day it is, if you attend 75% of the classes, hopefully you know 75% of the syllabus.
Yeah.
But the implicit assumption is that a student who is in class is listening. But both as students, I mean, both while I was a student and now that I'm a professor, I know that is not the case.
Yeah.
That just being in class doesn't necessarily mean that you learn. And
but what it necessarily would mean is that there's a negative externality that you might be causing for the students
for the other students
learning.
Indeed. Yeah. And the online attendance thing has just accentuated this problem. So yes, I think it's a challenge that us in academia, we have to at least start thinking about it.
That's a good point. So yeah, I mean, with that, we now come to another player in this market, which is the international universities. Right, and we see year after year the numbers have been increasing, wherein students are moving out to do their undergrads, their masters, and all from international universities. Of course, these are students who have the sort of funding to sponsor themselves, but those increasing numbers, that growth rate that we are observing, could one of the reasons behind that growth rate would be the education system that we have, like the status quo of the education system that we have in the country? Are students voting with their feet, wherein they're saying we're not getting enough learning? I mean, maybe those are the students who care lesser about degrees and more about the learning, and therefore they want to go to a university that provides them more learning. Or it could be the alternative scheme wherein they are sorting, and they're sorting to a much higher ranked university. So what's your take on that?
I think it will be a multivariate model. So a part of it will be sorting, but this is a pure guess on my part. I have no data to back this up, but at least through outcome, if not by intention, students benefit most through the peer networks that they develop abroad, more than the learning itself. And these days, because of Coursera, you can get the learning for a fraction of the cost of moving abroad. Then why move abroad? What are the other two things? One is a signaling mechanism. A degree from, let's face it, Harvard is any day going to be better than any university in India. I'm not saying that the learning is necessarily better, but I think it's a safe thing to say that the certificate from Harvard will have more weightage than any certificate from any Indian university. So more for the signaling and for the peer networks. And by peer networks, I don't just mean the students, but I mean everybody that you meet while you're abroad is an invaluable asset that you gain when you join a university. You gain that asset over here also in all Indian universities. But the quality of that peer network, the reach of that peer network, and the efficiency of that peer network is manifold in any university abroad than it is in India, simply because of the diverse nature of contacts that you'll make across both your professors as well as your students. And that, I think, is something that we can't compete with just yet. Maybe the NEP will have an impact on that, but we've been down this road before. For the last 20 years, we've been hearing about how this is going to change. I don't think it has changed all that much in the last 2 decades, at least. So for peer networks and for signaling, I think it makes sense to go abroad. Like you said, if you can afford it.
Yeah. But I mean, we wouldn't want to end there. We would want to know. So for instance, Ahmedabad University, and there are many others, which are the new Gen University, which are trying to compete with these international players. We are trying to compete for the students who would otherwise have gone out, but we want them to stay back because we are delivering the quality education.
Yeah.
But I mean, what are some of these aspects that these international universities deliver, other than, of course, the name, that we are still missing out in the Indian setup? So, I mean, one you mentioned is the peer network, which is basically the international peer network. I mean, people from different countries, you get to meet them. They all may be the cream from their own countries. As a result, I mean, you are in that different kind of peer network. But what is it that we as the private and the public university setups can do to change that approach of students and start looking inwards, start appreciating what we are offering within the country?
This is purely from a personal viewpoint. So again, I can't cite any paper to back up what I'm about to say. But I would argue that we should try to internationalize both our faculty as well as our students. So each university in India, I think, can easily, and 10x is maybe not applicable across all universities, but at least double the number of students that we get in from abroad and double the number of faculty that we get in from abroad. And at the same time, double the number of students that we send abroad and double the number of faculty that we send abroad. So a lot more flow should happen across international universities. And whether it is through MOUs, whether it is through tie-ups, whether it is at the governmental level, the mechanism or the specific mode doesn't matter, but we need much richer experiences in terms of peer networks at both the faculty and the student level. One. Second, this is a wish of mine, and I don't know who to speak to make sure that this happens more in Indian academia, but faculty internships. And what I mean by that is, it should be necessary for us, people in faculty, to go and work in industry. Because the kind of teaching that we can give to our students, I think, will become much richer for us having worked in the corporate world. I say that both because I worked in the corporate world before entering academia, but because it's one thing for us to say how to solve a problem at the end of the textbook. It's quite another to solve a live problem with a deadline in a company for real money. So having that skin in the game experience as a faculty member, I think, will make our teaching much richer. And the flip side of that, I wish we could institute a mechanism where we could get scholars in residence from industry. So imagine, say, for example, a VP or an AVP or a C, it's unlikely that a CEO will come, but somebody from middle to senior management who comes and spends 1, 3, 6 months on campus. Teaches a course if he or she wishes to, great. But if not, just stick around on campus, speak with the students in the evening once classes are over, conduct special sessions on the weekend, whatever it may be. But students should get the exposure of what people with real industry experience also have to say. Are 3 things that I would want if you're talking about what change I would wish for Indian universities to become better, these 3 would be top of my wish list. And 4th, which is always constant, we need to be better at our examinations. I don't know how Ahmedabad University does it, but in the case of both the Gokhale Institute and other colleges where I teach, I wish we were allowed to be more imaginative in how we conduct examinations. That is something that really needs to change.
Agreed. So now that I think of education production function, there's still one variable that we are missing out, which is parents and their role. So with that, I mean, I'm reminded of an instance. So I was walking from like my office to a classroom, and there were like a couple of students walking behind me, having their own interaction, and they didn't realize I'm a professor moving ahead. So one of them was telling the other that I wanted to do a BA psychology, but my parents didn't allow me because they just hate the term BA. So
Yeah.
I'm doing a BSc.
Yeah.
Right now, from there, basically, I want to know how much of an interference or an influence do parents have in our academic life as students? Because culturally, like Indian society is such wherein, I mean, our decision making is not independent of what our parents want from us.
Yeah.
So in that sense, where we are today, the rote learning, running behind marks, all those things, how much of that is attributed to parents in this entire problem?
So I can speak from personal experience to start with. I'm an engineering dropout, and I got into engineering for the reason that I think most kids in India get into engineering. My dad advised me to get into engineering. I hated science. Unfortunately, scored well enough in my 12th standard to get a seat in an engineering college. But in my first semester itself, I realized I wasn't cut out for it. And thankfully, without having been taught it, I realized what the sunk cost fallacies, and I said, I'm done. I'm out right now. Unfortunately for me, I won that particular battle, but I lost the war. What I wanted to do was to major in English literature, but I was advised by my family to at least do something respectable in the arts. And that's how I ended up in economics. So it sounds weird for a guy who's got a PhD in economics to say this, but economics is a bread and butter thing for me. It isn't really a passion. I enjoy teaching, but hey, I could have taught something else. It just happens to be economics. So from a personal viewpoint, I completely agree with you. Parents are going to have a say in what their children do. I can't speak with first-hand experience of whether that is the case for the students who enter higher education now. Hopefully things have changed over time. So at least from Pune, the data that I'm told is that arts these days has a higher cutoff than science, which is a wonderful thing to listen to given my experiences. So maybe things are changing now. But yes, I get the same kind of questions that you do, that what is the difference between a BSc and a B Arts, and somehow a BSc is seen as being better than B Arts and so on and so forth. And parents still have relatively strong opinions. But there I would argue the fact that we are a much richer economy today with much higher personal disposable incomes than was the case 30 to 40 years ago. And above all, the fact that a large number of jobs are available now, and this is only increasing compared to the past, that hopefully parents will feel safer with their children choosing something outside of the typical engineering or medicine courses. Again, I have no data to back this up, but I think it's a fairly safe thing to say that we should be okay assuming that it's not quite the same story as it used to be earlier. And more power to, so for example, if my daughter were to come up to me and say that she wants to become a hairdresser, she's all of 8 right now, so that to her is a very realistic career. I am totally okay with it, but I know for a fact that my dad will not be okay with it. Yeah. So across generations, I think these things are beginning to change, and hopefully that is something that will only grow stronger in the years to come.
Yeah. So I think so we are running out of time, so I'll take maybe one last question, and then we can open the floor for discussions.
Sure.
The questions. So it's although the last question, but it's definitely not the least, because it is about you and me and the instructor breed in general.
Yeah.
We know students are not doing it rightly. We know that universities are probably not delivering the right kind of product that we want from the students. What is it that we are doing, or what is it that we can do to ensure that even though there's a sort of mismatch of the objectives, we nudge it in a way, we maneuver the preferences of the two entities in a way that we push it towards the desirable goal of the education system. So what is it that we as instructors can do? And to add on to that, like as an instructor yourself, what are some of the examples that like you can share with us? I mean, I would love to know, and probably other instructors that are there here would love to know, what is it that we can do inside the classroom to make sure that students, they start thinking beyond the grades. I mean, every time I sort of conduct an exam, at the end of it, as you were saying, students would come to me asking, why did I sort of lose half a point on this question? So why is it that big a discussion, and how can we make students move beyond it?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. So where grades are concerned, I've all but given up, in the sense that it's just the world that we live in. And all right, students are going to fight over half a mark, 1 mark, 3 marks, whatever it may be. But if at the start of the semester, in every class that I teach, I make it clear that marks don't matter to me. That all right, whatever marks I give you, yes, we'll have that battle and do all of that. But I can't tell you how much I hate the concept of examinations and marks. I say this in the first class in all semesters, in all classes that I teach, to make clear to students that I am hopefully more about learning than I am about examinations. And at least where the class is concerned, let's make sure that you understand that I am not at all hung up on how much marks you get. First. Second, step away from teaching as much as possible. But this is a fine line to tread. What I mean by that is, if while doing my research for a particular class, I find a video that I think is going to do a better job than I can in the classroom, then I should step away and either assign that video for students to watch before they enter the class, or watch the video together and then speak about it. But students should never feel as if I'm quite literally forcing my lecture upon them. And if anything, in an ideal scenario, it should be students who should be able to come up to me and say, hey, Prof, you know what, this is something that I have seen, and perhaps you might want to share it with the students. Would be another great way of getting students involved with, all right, who can do a better job than my prof can in the classroom? Is a wonderful assignment to send students down that particular rabbit hole. And the third thing that so more innovative ways of asking questions in examinations, I think, can force students to have fun even while writing examinations and scoring marks. So I'll tell you 3 of my favorite things that I would like to do in terms of innovative exams, but because of the rules that the UGC imposes on us, I don't think we're able to do them the way we would want to. The first is, and I learned about this from Chris Blattman, design your question paper and answer it, and I'll grade you both for the quality of the questions and the quality of the answers. So there is no question paper. The students have to design the question paper. They're graded for the question paper that they design, and they're graded for the answers that they write for that particular question paper, which is genius. I love it. But of course, we can't make something like that happen and have it be approved in our internal examination systems. One. Second, I actually did try this out for a bunch of students who were here on a semester abroad program. So I taught them, I think it was a solo model. And having taught them the solo model, I said, you go and explain the solo models to your batchmates who haven't taken DevEcon. And those students will then write a multiple choice question. And what marks they get is the marks that my students get. So we all say, right, that teaching is the best way to learn. So all right, go ahead and teach what you've learned and let's see how good a job you've done of it. And that makes the scoring of the marks fun. But for the obvious reason that there are a lot of issues associated with this, it's something that can't scale. And the third thing that I would like to do in terms of making scoring marks more interesting is, and again, this is due to Chris Blattman, he used to allow his students to get a cheat sheet into the exam hall. So he says, all right, one A4 sheet, you write what you want on it, come in, write the answer to the paper that I have set for you, but you must also submit your cheat sheet. And both will be evaluated, your answer and your cheat sheet. So what did the student think was important enough to get into the classroom, or what did the student not feel confident about and therefore needed to get into the classroom, also becomes whatever it is that the student is evaluated for. So in other words, okay, you want to score marks, but score marks for learning, not for rote memorizing. How do we make more of that happen? Could be one way in which we get students more interested in scoring marks, but for the right reasons, incentive compatibility, in other words.
In that cheat sheet, I mean, they should have a minimum font size requirement. Otherwise, you know what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So all of those rules will have to be set. You can write on the margin. You can use only this particular font and all of that. Yeah, so you can set those rules, but it's still interesting to see.
Yes. So yeah, so Ashish, I mean, this has all been a great conversation. Although, I mean, I wanted to end it with your utopian worldview of the education as you would like to see. But I think more or less we've got I mean, some ideas on how the consumers, which are the students, should behave. How should the universities sort of take the responsibilities? Most importantly, how should the instructors conduct the classes, examinations, so that students, even though, I mean, they may have their own preferences, we are nudging them towards what we want them to take away from the class.
Great.
So thank you so much. And now I'll ask Sudhir to sort of take the questions.
Yeah, thank you to both of you. Yeah. And this time we have equal number of questions from a student and from the faculty both. So I would like to invite Rajiv first, if Rajiv can come on camera and ask his question.
So Very good evening to Professor Assis as well as Professor Punit. So my question is actually both a question as well as a comment. So actually, and most of it got answered while the discussion went on. So actually, we were discussing that economic framework, and then we also got into the normative framework, that what we wish to do. So a lot of it was talked about at a later stage by Professor Assis and all. So what I would like to question that, how do you see from the national education policy perspective, since Ahmedabad University is also trying to set up a liberal arts kind of a university. So how do you see that liberal arts? And there was a discussion around arts and sciences, and there is also a hierarchy around that. There is engineering and all. So there is a hierarchy in the minds of parents specifically, and then this these questions around so to use a very crude word, that rat race and all that. So how do you see all these aspects? So to be a little precise, so how liberal arts institutions see rat race happening in the educational spectrum, and how do you want to curb that phenomenon, setting up a liberal arts institution?
So curbing the rat race won't necessarily only be solved by setting up liberal arts institutions, for two reasons. One, because the quality of the liberal arts institutions will to a very great extent depend upon the quality of the faculty, and making good liberal arts institutions scale up across the entire country is easier said than done. The constraint is quality of faculty. Rat race, I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. Changing it requires changing the expectations of parents, changing the expectations of students, changing the way we have conducted examinations. Inertia is a very real problem. But eventually, over time, either make examinations more interesting or figure out a way to replace examinations through project-based learning. But I'm very much aware of the fact that it's easy for me to see this. Implementing this on the ground is not going to be easy. So I write blog posts that tell people about how I wish it would eventually look like, but how to reach there from where we are right now is a journey of 1,000 miles. And the first 10 to 50 miles are going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah, actually moving from a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and fusing it into a transdisciplinary approach. Yeah. That is the biggest challenge. Even in our universities, we see our faculty to be working in silos. So those are evident challenges that we see. Okay, absolutely. So thank you for your answer.
Thank you so much, Rajiv, for asking that. Now I would like to invite Soumya to ask the question. Soumya, if you're able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, good evening. So I think we are also part of the academic community, and so very interesting insights, I guess, from both Professors Arora and Professor Kulkarni. The question I had was that you are seeing a lot of conventional structures breaking down. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, you find that average students are now going abroad because parents are able to afford higher education, etc., etc. Maybe a lot of Indian schools are getting better at bringing practice to the class, with practitioners from industry also teaching, capstone projects and so on and so forth. You have education policies and so on. So the question I had was that when you're looking at, let's say, giving, raising the education in this country and bringing it to global levels, some institutes, I don't want to name them, have brought in professors from Harvard and various other places as well. But generally, it has all been kind of an experiment. Yeah. If we have to kind of actually make this a standard, uniform, program where Indian education is at par with anywhere else in the world, and not just later say, okay, IITs and IIMs send some people abroad to become CEOs and see how good Indian basic education is.
Yeah.
How do we kind of actually create that uniform code along with the NEP to bring universities to world-class levels? I mean, a lot of ideas you brought about were, reflections and how things could be done better.
Yeah.
But for instance, what we find is there's a disconnect between academics and policymakers, or policymakers and administrators, universities with different, charter for profits versus, holistic education. So how does this all come together in your view, is my question.
It's a difficult question to try and answer. I'll give it a shot. I think all of the constituents associated with this market will need to experience a change in mindset. And again, it's easy for me to say, but it's very difficult for this to actually work out in practice. But parents need to change the expectation that they have from students. Students need to stop viewing university as a place to score marks and get a job. University needs to change the way it thinks of both students and classrooms. Regulators need to think about what is best, not just in terms of policy announcements, but how much of them are actually implementable on the ground, is a starting place. And then from here, for each of these answers, you could go down into the constituents or the respective constituents in each case. But if I have to give a one size fits all and therefore generalized answer, I think it needs to start by asking what is it that you want from the education system that you're a part of. And in India, at least, I would argue, especially where higher education is concerned, especially at the master's level, it is more about finding employment than it is about learning. And so the passion for learning, I'm sorry to state, just isn't there in universities. And trust me, I say this out of experience. This is not me saying this in a vacuum. How to reignite that passion is, before you solve that, I don't think anything else really matters. And for that, I don't think anything matters more than the quality and the love for teaching that a professor is able to get into a classroom. But that unfortunately doesn't scale. You can't select on the basis of that. And I don't know how to solve that problem. But a lack of passion is the first answer that I would want to give to you. I don't know how helpful that was, but that is where I would start from.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Soumya. Next, I would like to invite Danish. Danish, you're able to unmute yourself, and if you can ask a question.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to participate. It's brilliant listening to your insights and ideas. So I had a comment which is essentially about parents' preferences for children. And the comment was typically what we see in India, there's a bit of a dichotomy. Early on, parents prefer to send their children to private schools with the hope that they make it to public universities later in life. And it's an interesting dichotomy in one sense, because there's a lot of faith that private schools are able to deliver adequate level of education, that a child later on may then be eligible to succeed in a public university. So I was just hoping for what your thoughts on what drives that dichotomy may be. Thank you.
Thanks. My answer to that question would be that I think the perception is that private schools are better at tutoring children in how to crack examinations that will get you into those quality universities. So it's sorting all over again. So the fact that you think that you're likely to get into a better college because you've been to a better school, and that school is better at tutoring you in how to get into that college, is why those schools are selected. And we've all heard horror stories of how, say, for example, kids start preparing for the IIT entrance examination from the 4th grade these days, or how. So I have had offers when my daughter was about 3 years old to teach her skills that would be necessary for her to appear for an interview to get into school. And I found that to be the most insane thing I've ever heard of, that there are tuition classes that will get your kid into a school. So in response to your question, it's not really about schools getting into colleges, it's about getting into schools in the first place. But it really is about, well, how do I reach the next tier in the educational ladder, so to speak? So can I start with getting into a good school, from a good school, getting into a good college, from a good college, getting into a good university, and so on and so forth. But that I think is my answer would be that is where it starts from, sorting literally from birth. Maybe I'm being too cynical, who knows?
Thank you, Danish. And now I would like to invite one of our students, Veena. Veena, are you there? Can you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, sir. So, good evening. It was
Hi.
a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. So, my question is related to something you mentioned in the beginning, that the students aren't really to blame if they are optimizing or they're preferring more signaling or preferring higher marks, because they are responding to incentives that they get. So, who determines the incentive in that case? Because in microeconomics we learned that there's an invisible hand, and it's the collective effect of everyone making their individual decisions. Then everyone making a decision to have higher marks, and then that's creating an incentive for students to get higher marks, and it's a self-reinforcing cycle. Then who exactly is the society that is creating that incentive of getting higher marks? Is it the parents? Is it the school, or the previous generations even?
So one of Puneet's questions was around this, and at least part of the blame, I would think, goes to the people who recruit from universities. So what they want to do is they want to get an objective way of assessing how good or bad a student is, and the cheapest in terms of time way of assessing a student is to take a look at the student's marks. So when I teach macro, for example, I often tell students that GDP for a country is like marks for a student. So in much the same way that marks don't tell me all that I need to know where, say, for example, you are concerned, Veena, similarly, GDP doesn't tell me all that I need to know about a nation. But it is the quickest way of assessing the health of an economy, GDP. And in much the same way, marks are the quickest and the cheapest way to assess how good a student is relative to other students. So the ease of using one objective measure called marks, the efficiency associated with it in terms of time, means that whether it is recruiters, whether it is parents, whether it is us professors, we prefer to use these marks rather than other more complicated, more subjective methods of assessing a student. So it's the hunt for efficiency that has popularized the concept of marks. And we need to acknowledge that life isn't always about being most efficient for us to be able to move away from marks. But I think the theme of my talk today has been that's easier said than done. And I'll say that in this case also.
Thank you, Veena. Now I would like to invite Professor Sonal Yadav. If you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Ashish and Puneet, for this wonderful talk. I enjoyed every bit of the conversation. So my question is, companies like Apple and Google are hiring without college degrees. So is this disruption in education, and what would be the impact of this in future education? So is it that the quality would going to go up, or I mean, it would reduce the quality?
Thank you. I would probably describe myself as being cautiously optimistic about the fact that Google, and I think it is IBM, that has decided to not take a look at marks anymore. And if I remember correct, I'm quoting from memory, so I might be wrong right now, but I think it was Google that conducted an internal examination and analysis of its employees and found out there actually wasn't a very strong correlation between what marks a student scored and how well that student did while being an employee at Google. And more power to more research like this. I wish more such research was made available. My hypothesis is that the marks that you score in a degree don't necessarily correlate well with how well you do later on in life. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that exams and marks are not important, but I'm saying they don't necessarily correlate with performance later on in life, or there might be other factors at play. So I hope this is the start of a trend, and more companies say that, hey, you know what, we don't need marks, we need other better indicators of how well a student does. And that forces students, parents, educators, and policymakers to ask, well, what can come in the place of the standard evaluation techniques that we have right now? But the reason I said cautiously optimistic is because the fact that we can cite to each other only 2 companies means there's a long way to go just yet.
So do you think that this would increase dropout? Like if no other companies also start adopting this in future, dropout in higher education will have any impact?
difficult
Because
to
everybody would think that,
Yeah.
okay, it's good to, get job in big companies, and every student aspire to get jobs in these companies. And who would not like to work with Apple or Google?
Yeah, so I think, I hope that what will happen is universities will acknowledge that we still have a role to play in society, but providing marks in examinations is not our role. Our role is much more and much richer than that. So if we assume a static equilibrium in which only the company says that, hey, you know what, I'm going to change my method for recruiting students, but the university system doesn't respond in turn, that would be a pretty poor outcome. What I hope happens is the market acknowledges that marks and mark sheets are not being demanded anymore. Certain other things are, and universities spend time in figuring out what those other things are and makes them more palatable and makes them more amenable where parents, students, and regulatory authorities are concerned. Is my hope. I don't know if it'll happen, but that's what I
Thank you
hope
so
for. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Sonal. Now I would like to invite one of our MA Economics student, Ayush. Ayush, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, sir. Thanks. So, sir, my question is that on epistemological grounds, how can we assure that whatever we are learning and teaching are true? Basically, I have seen that most often people attach their ego with their education or with what they have known and they have been knowing. And this leads to bigotry and so on and so forth. So do you think that there is some sort of negative effect or iatrogenics related to what we have been learning and producing and disseminating as knowledge?
Wow. If you are asking whether whatever it is that professors teach is taken as received wisdom and that students tend to not question whatever it is that they are learning, I would argue yes. And I hope that this changes both in terms of students becoming more assertive and saying to the professor that I don't agree with what you said. Of course, assuming that this is done respectfully, and professors at the margin inviting students more to disagree with them. Classrooms ought to be about questioning and debate. They ought not to be about one-way flow of information from the professor to the students. Daniel Kahneman has a lovely story. Well, actually, it's Michael Lewis's story. I think he speaks about in a book called The Undoing Project. Students in Israel, when Danny Kahneman was teaching over there in the 1950s, were asked to refer to their professors by their first names. So if, say, for example, Ayush, you are my student, you would call me Ashish. And not only would you just call me Ashish, you were expected to argue with me in class. I think that it's an easy thing for us in India to say this. I, for example, still can't bring myself to call my professors by their first name. They're always going to be sir for me. And that's just a culture that we are a part of. But at the margin, I don't mind being a bit of a hypocrite and telling my students to call me Ashish. So hopefully in future generations, this will change. And the reason I bring this point up, Ayush, is because I don't know whether it's a problem of epistemology, whether it is a problem of us not rising up to the opportunity in terms of debating the people that we learn from. But I think there needs to be more back and forth in our classrooms. There needs to be more debate, more discussion. Again, obviously, assuming that this is done in a respectful manner, but you learn best when you argue. You don't learn best when you listen. Debate and discussion is the best way to learn. And that to me is, I think, where the solution to your problem lies.
Yes, sir. I mean, healthy debate is the base of democracy, right? But the point is that we people who go into institutes and universities, we have this culture. But most often people who are not getting into universities like ours, they are not having this culture and so on. And they are actually dominating this segment. And then we see all sort of communal violence and so on and so forth, which are based on what they have received as education. So that was my point, that can we actually change this dynamics and create a better world and so on?
Right. So Ayush, what you're saying is this culture already exists in your university, and that is awesome to hear. But that culture should permeate through all universities in this country. That is where I'm coming from. So whether it happens in the Gokhale Institute or the Ahmedabad University or a few select universities across the country isn't the question. How do we make all schools and colleges have this culture? And how do we build this from the ground up? And what needs to change in our society for this to happen? I'm not saying that school kids start calling their teachers by their first name, but I do mean that there be more debate and discussions in classroom rather than one-way lectures. How to broad base that is, I think, the real question. And I think it's a function of in this sense being more globalized. So understanding what are the best practices abroad and slowly but surely adopting them is, I think, the way this will change.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Thank you, Ayush. Now I would like to invite Amol Agrawal, Professor Amol, if you can unmute yourself. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, hi Ashish.
Hi.
It was absolutely wonderful. And in fact, Puneet himself has kind of written a recent paper on, which has come on this. Puneet has been humble about his, but he's also written on this. So maybe we'll get to hear sometime later what Puneet has to say on education. So Ashish, I mean, it's a tall compliment, but you know, Adam Smith would be very proud to hear what you just said because
This is a
Professor
very tall
Adam Smith,
compliment.
you know, because he also spoke about the fact that you know, universities and colleges don't children or basically they're serving the masters, and he spoke about the need for competition between faculties to improve,
Yeah.
and for a long time we've not really allowed that to happen, and I think faculties and universities are to be blamed for this. And this pandemic induced technology is which forced us to look at basically ways to continue our livelihood is what prompted us to look at the Zoom as a technology, because these technologies have been there and several people wrote about it as the pandemic struck, that they have been there, but somehow academics were preventing it from there. So your thoughts on this, though you've spoken about this quite a bit, some thoughts on you know, how this technology. So you've touched on it, but maybe some more from historical lenses, if you could point to things. Second is obviously, though this is out of syllabus, but I believe you set questions for you know, out of syllabus, but you know, so something on your blog which is quite interesting. So what motivates you to write? And I mean, if it was not for your blog, I wouldn't have really, you know, most of us wouldn't have really seen your stuff. So some thoughts on blogging and maybe what can our students do to learn blogging and do it and so on and so forth. Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
All right, great. Well, about Adam Smith, yes, it's the tallest compliment I ever have and will ever be paid. But you're quite right. Adam Smith has written, and others have written about how in his university, professors had to go out and hawk their courses. They had to get students into their courses. So that competition between professors, you're right, has been lost over time. About technology, so I used to show occasionally some videos in class before the pandemic started, but I've never conducted a class remotely or online before the pandemic. But like you said, all of us have been forced to use technology better. And if anything, I would argue that we are hopefully now at a place where we can't ever go back to not using technology in classrooms. There will be some inertia, but whether it is the use of technology in order to conduct classes or whether it is to use resources that are available online, I can speak with some expertise about teaching economics, but I'm sure there are games, there are websites, there are programs that allow you to teach much, much better by having students participate in games online. So outside of the lectures being conducted, utilization of better teaching techniques, games is just one example, is something that I think we need to very carefully think about. And when I say very carefully think about, perhaps even I'm never a fan of making anything mandatory, but at least encourage professors to include some amount of online games, polls, surveys, whatever it may be, to get students more interested while they are in the classroom. And I'm sorry, I forgot the third. Oh yes, about the blogging bit. So Econ for Everybody was born in the year 2016, quite literally at a McDonald's. So I and my wife were waiting, having a cup of coffee while our daughter was in first day in school. And we said we should really write online about economics, which is where it got started. The first 3 or 4 years were just I posting file links every day. So stuff that I read on that day that I found interesting, I would just quite literally link to those 5 articles. But over time, especially the last 2.5 years, I've become, I shouldn't say regular right now because I haven't updated the blog for almost 2 weeks, but reasonably more regular than I was earlier. And it's been so beneficial to any student who's listening right now. The kind of people I've been able to meet, Amol himself is an example, but there are so many the world over, is invaluable. So I've been able to reach out to professors, policymakers, authors, YouTube creators. I can go on and on. Whether I reach out to them or in some cases they reach out to me because of the blog, it's invaluable. So if any student is wondering about whether they should start a blog, an Insta page, Twitter feed, whatever it may be, but the idea that you put what you're thinking out in the public domain for others to consume is a life skill that I strongly think all of us should possess. And I say this for having written EFE, so I'm not saying this in a vacuum, but please, if you're a student listening to this, start writing, start creating stuff, do whatever it is that shows the world what it is that you're interested in, what it is that you're passionate about, and here is how we've gotten better at it over time. If I could wave a wand and make sure that everybody does this, I would. It's heavily recommended.
Thank you so much, Amol. Now I would like to invite Professor Supratim, and I know it is 5:30, but I took your time already. I initially requested, so thank you so much for giving us 10 more minutes or 5 more minutes.
No worries.
Professor Supratim, if you can come on camera and ask a question.
Yes, am I audible?
Sure.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ashish, for this very insightful conversation. I think we had a lot of things to think about. I mean, rather than the solutions, we at least know what to think. Now, my question is like kind of related to what Professor Sonal and our student Ayush asked, that we have developed this culture of education being a status symbol also. For your future endeavors in life, and also a compliment not to you, like I mean directly, but on the topics that you raised, that Rabindranath once said in Bengali that education shouldn't be a burden; it should be a vehicle. So my question is that talking about Germany post World War II. It went to this model of having a lot of vocational schools. Like, we don't expect everybody to go to college. It is a waste of their time. It's a waste of faculty's time. It's a waste of the resources. They are better equipped if they know how to dismantle a car engine, how to like put that together, get a job, be happy in life. End of the story. Yep. And this has been continuing in Germany for a very long time. Not sure how, but this is one country. And in India also, post 1940. We had some culture of vocational schools, like training institutes, where they would teach, especially females, the art of embroidery, the art of stitching. Then you had vocational schools where how to make homeopathic, like the medicines were taught, and these were institutionalized. I'm not saying that it was like something like related to 2000 years ago. It was the contemporary thought at the time. And that used to guarantee some kind of and there was also engineering diploma. It was not a full engineering. There used to be diplomas. But it seems to me that over the last probably about 20 years, not very long ago, this thing has completely evaporated. Yep. Doesn't exist, and everybody wants to go to university or college and gain quote unquote learning, whatever that means. Now, why should I'm not being a societal, like a scientist, saying that who is to blame. I mean, what is the solution? But my question is, are we wrong culturally? Are we wrong culturally? Because I think what we need at the end of somebody turning 21, 22, whatever it is, or 20, is skills. Yep. Not necessarily learning. I mean, the two may go together, may not go together. So that is where that's just your thoughts on it. Thank you.
No, it's a great question. So my German is horrible and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but the Hochschule and the Fachschule, if I remember correctly, are the two schools in Germany. One of them is more about apprenticeship than it is about higher learning. And again, I'm not sure about the actual pronunciation. Sure. Yeah, sure. But yes, that culture is very much there. And I wish it was there in India. In fact, I have a blog post out on this called Lists and To-Dos. Irrespective of which stream you are studying in, certain life skills you should be able to do. I'm ashamed to say that I myself can't do them right now. I'm going to turn 40 next year. But say, for example, there's a short circuit in a wire board in my house right now. I don't know what to do. All I'm going to do is call a local electrician. I should have the ability right now to be able to repair it, whether it is plumbing, whether it is electricity, basic woodwork, gardening. These are, well, I think of them as skills. And I think that all students should be taught these skills, not just because they're an important part of life in general, but because working on this is one of the best ways to learn about teamwork very early on in life. And one of the things that we don't do well in our educational system is to teach people how to get work done while being part of a team. Group assignments is not the answer. But for both of these reasons, to learn how to work better as a part of a team and to learn how to acquire skills and how to be more productive in your own home, yes, I very much argue that there are certain things that should be taught in higher education, irrespective of what you're studying otherwise. In fact, in this specific case, I'll send the blog post to you. And the reason I'll send it to you is because I'm very curious to hear what other people's lists might look like. What are the basic non-negotiable life skills that you should possess if you say that you finished higher education? So carpentry, plumbing, basic electricity and gardening were 4 on my list. I can't remember the rest right now. But yes, I think this is a mandatory part of any curriculum anywhere. I completely agree.
Thank you so much, Supratim. Now I would like to call Professor Pallavi Vyas to share her comments and ask questions. If you can unmute yourself. You're still muted, so.
I can't.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just got logged off. Hi, Ashish, thanks a lot. You guys were talking a lot about the MOOC stuff and the online education and everything. And one thing that I really suffered during the pandemic was one thing that where learning really happens is with trust, when there's trust between the student and the faculty member, and we became like unknown, we were strangers to each other in these classrooms, and I saw the impact of that on learning, right? Like the students just didn't care because they didn't know you and they didn't trust you, and so I just feel like, and then also your own passion for the subject can't really come through when you're so impersonal, And so I just don't see how this online stuff can ever substitute for the classroom or for the in-person, like the movement that you guys were talking about. Like you're giving something else. You're not giving an education. You might be giving some kind of learning, but you're not giving a true education. And the thing is that everybody, like all students are indifferent when they come in. They're like, oh, I got to go to class. But then you see that, 20% of the students you can ignite.
Yep.
You can ignite them, and start feeling passionate about it. And that cannot happen online.
Okay. So let me respond by saying 3 things. First, I completely agree with you. And it's not just the fact that you can't develop that level of trust. I have realized, and I'm sure anybody who's in this profession will also have realized, the extent to which we depend on being able to assess whether students have understood what we're saying or not simply by taking a look at their expressions. I can't tell you how much I miss it because you can't. In the online world, nobody turns on their cameras. Yeah. So for example, Pallavi, you and I, we can see each other. We are reacting to the expressions that is on each other's faces, but that just doesn't happen online. So not just trust, but also the inability to express not having understood is missing in online classes. So I can't wait for old style offline classes to begin. Yeah. But that being said, and I just noticed while you were speaking, and I'll tell you where I'm coming from with this, but I just noticed that Puneet is wearing a white shirt and I happen to be wearing black today. I promise you this was not previously planned. But the reason I bring this point up is because I think the answer lies not in a black and white solution, but in a gray part of the spectrum. So rather than having 100% online like we've had during the pandemic, and rather than having 0% online before the pandemic, I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle. I don't know where exactly, and that was something that all professors will and all students will have a different opinion about. But somewhere in the middle is something I feel safe in saying. So for example, if say, for example, I'm able to call Amol to speak on monetary economics, our students should not be deprived of learning from Amol just because he happens to not be in Pune. But that doesn't mean all courses should be online. Some students might prefer a higher percentage online. Some students might prefer a lower percentage online. But that would be my second answer to your question. And the third would be to say that at the end of the day, I think what universities will have to do is unbundle the learning component to whatever extent we deem possible, but then have the professors speak to the students who happen to be located in that university. So a debriefing session, and for students to speak to each other and to have the collegial atmosphere, even if the nature of the classroom changes, there still is a role for the university, for a brick and mortar setup, and for personal interaction and mentoring. It's just that it won't happen, I think, in the same way that it used to happen earlier. But mentoring, without mentoring, learning can't happen. Absolutely. Would be my 3 responses.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Puneet to share some comments, closing comments.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Ashish. I mean, it has been an immense pleasure for us to sort of discuss on a topic which probably connects to everybody here. Or like people not here, it probably pertains to everybody. And like in your unbundling of the university idea, we've actually unbundled a lot of issues that the education system has been facing and it's still currently facing. It's always important to know about the problems. I mean, solutions can be found only once you recognize what the problems are in the system, right? And as researchers, I mean, who can recognize that better than us, right? So, so that is something that has come out very clearly in today's interaction with you. And of course, a lot of interesting questions that came later by the participants. So, I mean, I personally have learned a lot. I also do research in education, but I mean, I never thought about these things in so much detail, which you, I mean, a discussion with you happened to sort of lead to. So yeah, so thank you again for so much of enlightenment. Of course, all of us now need to take a step forward and start finding the solutions to these problems, right? And yeah, so in the classroom, we'll try to bring the change. In the university, we'll try to bring the change, and therefore there'll be a change in the world soon. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming for the webinar. Yeah.
No, thank you for inviting me. This was a wonderful, wonderful talk. And I can't wait to read the paper that you have written that Amol spoke about. But thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Sure. I'll share that with you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashish, and thank you so much, Puneet. And this was very interesting. And because it is concerned with us, so we were engrossed to the entire conversation all the time. But I'm very, very thankful to those people who asked very interesting questions at the end. And thanks, Ashish, again for your patience and giving us time for answering each question in detail. So we are grateful to both of you, particularly Ashish. And we are thankful to all the people, those who joined today. And take care, good night, and we'll see you soon in our next conversation. Till then, take care.